Okay, welcome. This is lecture 2 of the Gyan course on postcolonial ecocriticism. And the first part of this, we were doing a survey and having a lot of names and so forth, and we may still encounter a number of names of critics as well as writers. I did not have time at the end of the last lecture as planned to talk about just 3 representative Native American writers, so I may get to them later, but I did want to mention that indigenous perspective because I think moving forward. So one was Linda Hogan, who is a poet and essayist, and notice that each of these writers represents a different Native American tribe. And so they do use the word tribe, but some places they may not. So Linda Hogan talks about, for example, the dog wants to know, did you ever harm an animal, hurt any creature? Did you take a life you didn't eat? Right? And so that's obviously a direct criticism of the settler notion. So I wanted to mention these indigenous views. And she also says that, and I think this is an important perspective that we can all learn from. It has been my lifelong work to seek an understanding of the two views of the world, one as seen by Native people, and the others as seen by those who are new and young on this continent. It is clear that we have strayed from the treaties we once had with the land and with the animals. It is also clear and disheartening that in our time there are many, Indian and non-Indian alike, who want to restore and honor those broken agreements. So the Native American perspective, just as whether in Canada or America, in Canada they prefer the term First Nation, that perspective is about broken agreements, right, which was often the case, about displacement, disease, and so they're still living with that legacy. Another one is Simon Ortiz, who is Pueblo, from southeastern US. And I was lucky enough to hear each of these poets. That's why I chose them at different times, read their poetry. He says, people are not born, they are made when they become human beings within ritual, tradition, purpose, responsibility. So they're not born human. That's a fascinating concept, right? It goes against everything that sort of a European modern outlook, or we might even say just modern outlook has. And then Joy Harjo, who is Muskogee Creek, notice these very specific terms, talks about here a poem, Granddaughters. I emerged from my mother's river on my father's boat of potent fever. Interesting. Like Hogan, she refers to starts conveying a mythic ethos. The planets, cave, moon, fish, wing, deerskin, and skins, these are parts of the words I'm taking out of the poems I assigned, all reflect a close connection of the Native American speaker to their natural surroundings. But I think the point to take away here is that these are modern writers, so they have a kind of double consciousness, right? They are trying to balance the modern and the traditional, but they're wonderfully eloquent in that regard. So the other writers that I did not have time to mention, some are writers, nonfiction creative writers, some are scholars, are Aldo Leopold, whose Sand County Almanac of 1949 was very important. He talked about the land ethic. And the book is a kind of hybrid of poetic description, natural observation, philosophical reflections, almost in the form of a journal, and kind of in the tradition of Thoreau, exactly 100 years later, and was equally, I think, influential. By land ethic, he basically means a thing is right. These are his words. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community it is wrong when it tends otherwise. So an ethic, again, what Native American indigenous peoples have said all along is to make a compact with nature. Don't harm nature more, don't use it more than you need to survive. So that land ethic could be seen as a modern um, way of articulating an indigenous sensibility. Um, but I think one thing that also made his book influential, like Rachel Carson, hers was even more influential, is that they have a scientific background. So but they are poets in a sense, right? And that's a rare combination. Another woman, quickly, a critic that I wanted to mention was Annette Kolodny's The Lay of the Land, 1975. This book was famous for, this is 50 years ago now, was famous for talking about how the colonization of land depended on seeing the land as female, both in sexual and reproductive ways, but also maternal ways. Now, on the surface, there's nothing wrong with most cultures in the world have seen nature as maternal, Mother Nature, on the surface. And to a degree, there's nothing wrong. But if that is combined with a kind of objectification of women and also women as expedients, they're only there to nurture the men, then that's a problem. So it depends on what context. It's interesting that in the Western United States, where my university is, it's maybe very close to this Yellowstone Park. It's not far from another park that's called the Tetons. I won't say what the Tetons, Teton, was a French word because there were a lot of French explorers in that area in the 1700s. And I can't say it here, but if you look up what the word Teton means, it's a sexual image, and no one knows that who lives in that area because they just know English and they just think Tetons. Yeah, it's a famous park. It's beautiful. But French trappers, men, after months in the wilderness, came upon these mountains and gave them a reference that is sexual reference to women. That's not, I often tell my students that, and they've never heard that, right? So that illustrates what Annette Kolodny is saying. And then, I think one of the points that applies to all of these talks, another point is, as you know from postcolonial critique, essentialism. So the idea of thinking that something has an integral essence that cannot be changed. This sometimes becomes part of a nationalist view. It can become part of a racial view. It become part of a gendered view. But I think this idea that land had a sort of essence that, first of all, that could not be changed, and secondly, that it was there to be used by, in American case, the white settlers, is a problem because land always changes. That's another thing we should learn. Land always changes. The peoples know this, right? They don't have a static view of land. They have a more fluid way of looking at both the boundaries between living peoples and others. So that's another thing that Annette Kolodny, she doesn't take an indigenous point of view. It's more feminist, but all of these writers together. And then finally, Mahashweta Devi and Vandana Shiva's work. And so they perhaps need no introduction, but I think Vandana Shiva, again, is very influential. 1988 book, Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development, and has been incredibly influential in helping, because of her PhD in the history of science, to help expose some of the multinationals like Monsanto. And I was just reading about Roundup, Do you know what Roundup is? Roundup is a brand name used by an American company for a pesticide that you could spray in your yard, and it has gly, glyphosate, glycophosphate, something like that. Don't ask me, but um, the point is she helped steer the world towards getting that banned. So Monsanto has had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for that, for the victims. I just saw in my hometown a billboard saying, help farmers preserve glycophosphate. In other words, they want to, they said Roundup, save Roundup. Because they say, well, if we don't use Roundup, we can't grow our fields, which is a very narrow way of looking at things. So this is real stuff. Now, how does this influence literature? We can talk about that. Okay, so what I'd like to do in this lecture too is start with the Columbian Exchange again, and that I alluded to in my very broad opening. And this is what we talk about, the exchange not just of foods, but of ideas, diseases, right? Crops and populations. So the so-called, they still tend to use the terms old world and new world. It's just a handy reference, but it's kind of interesting terminology. And that is this is Alfred Crosby who coined it in 1972. But he talks about how we think about sometimes a benign Columbian exchange. In other words, just foods, right? But as we know, the other thing that happened was one of the reasons that the European settlers could, with small numbers, take over was smallpox and other diseases that the Native Americans had no immunization against. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this then becomes in the handling of another, well, he also coined the term ecological imperialism, right? There is another critic I'll come to later who talks more about that, and that is Richard Grove, who has a book called Green Imperialism, which you might find interesting. But I read a book a long time ago, before I did Ecocriticism, called Plagues and Peoples by McNeill, a historian, and talks about how diseases shaped history. So now what we see is all the coming together of these different disciplines, right? To say, how do they, and you can see in these native indigenous writers, how they talk about these effects. So even though their ancestors died out, who bore the brunt of this hundreds of years ago, they still live with that, right? Partly because Native America, here's the other part of this, indigenous populations tend to preserve, still, to some degree, oral cultures. And I think that's the other part of this to keep in mind. And Amitav Ghosh does a good job of trying to represent that, as do a lot of Native American writers. So this idea of the orality, the orature of traditions, which had been denigrated. So let's talk about some, perhaps this might be a good place to talk about some key concepts in eco-criticism. And I'm just going to go through some of these terms, and then I'll look at how I have applied them to a reading of The Hungry Tide, right? In addition to some other works. So we talked about toxic discourse, right? One of those terms. Another one would be a term that I mentioned, Annette Kolodny, this idea of ecofeminism. So looking at, trying to look critically at how male writers have depicted nature, right? That's an important one. There's also something called new materialism, which tends to have been used by a lot of feminist writers, but it doesn't have to be. And that gives equal agency to not only nature, but objects. So things. Now you say, how can objects have agency? But it's a way to decenter human privilege, the priority of humans, to decenter humans. If you know the theorists, Deleuze and Guattari, for example, this idea of rhizomatic. These are just one of many. There's also Jane Bennett, who is a philosopher, really, talks about object ontology. So basically what she means, she talks about how, can we talk about how things have place, for example, the land, how, does it have agency, right? If we are giving agency, that could have legal ramifications as well. So I like this word entangled, which comes up a lot, which is that we are entangled in a web of both a sentient world, sentient meaning something that, or an organism that lives and responds to nature, right? And with some kind of sensibility, versus a non-sentient world, but also a world of objects. And this is what Timothy Morton calls also a mesh. It doesn't matter which term you use, entangled or mesh, right? There are many synonyms for these, but these are the two ones that seem to come up a lot. And that's the idea that we are entangled in this, right? There's an interesting anthropologist named Eduardo Kohn, Kohn, who talks about a book called Do Forests Think? And so he studies an Amazonian tribe. It becomes very philosophical and dense, but the basic idea is to say, can we give agency to not just non-human animals, but also trees, things like that. A wonderful book, if you're interested, is called The Overstory by Richard Powers. It came out in 2019, and I just taught it for the first time earlier this year. It's a wonderful way to think about trees having agency. The other term that comes up, we've talked about, is pastoral, right? So what is pastoral? So it comes from this word, it's related to the word pasture, right? So it comes from the idea of shepherding animals. So we talk about, for example, ecologists talk about pastoral peoples, right, who have goats or livestock of some sort. But pastoralism, especially in the Western context, has this idea of, it tends to be a view, these are fancy words, I know I'm throwing a lot of words, a declensionist view. That is a narrative of decline. The fancy word is post-lapsarian. All this means is that there was a perfect time, and this is informed sometimes by religious, Christian, Judeo-Christian ideas, that there was a perfect time and we have fallen. Now, a lot of these writers are not even religious. That's not the point. The point is it diffuses the culture, and it says, that's the romantics too. They say, we'll never really get back to what we were, right? You know, that's a kind of notion that Native Americans don't subscribe to, ironically. You might think they would because they have seen their culture destroyed. But they never saw it as a linear view where, oh, there was a golden age and now we're, as if we'll never get back there. That's a very sort of interesting way of looking at it. So I think this idea of, if you think of Paradise Lost, right? Humans have lapsed. That was the word that they preferred. And they have fallen. That word comes up a lot. And notice how Rachel Carson uses that very cleverly, right, to talk in certain ways. So when we say pastoralism, we tend to think of a kind of word like paradise, kind of, if you're talking about it in literature, which is interesting because we know paradise comes from Persian. It means a planned garden, right? A secure sanctuary, paradiso. So, but this idea that we have a pastoral eye, so sometimes that's why so much writing can become, it's hard to write about environment without sounding sentimental, or maybe the word is flowery, sort of trite. It's talking about, oh, how beautiful the flowers are. Now that's fine. We get that in a different context in Kalidasa's Shakuntala, which beautiful, right? Now I don't read the original Sanskrit, as some of you may, but it's still beautiful, you can see. So that's not in and of itself a problem. The problem is if you don't have a context in which to, if that's the only discourse you're looking at. So pastoralism then, and by the way, the key text for introducing eco-criticism is a very useful one by Greg Girard. It's in its third edition, right? So that's if you're interested. Wilderness, we've talked about that. So I have taught, to give you an idea of how humans have, most writing has come from cities. So if even in ancient times, the earliest recorded epic is Gilgamesh, Sumerian, on clay tablets. That is, that we know of, that's been discovered. 5,500 years old or something. It's about the city of Uruk that uses up all the cedar forest, right, to make its fancy doors and all. So they knew what they were doing. So here we have an idea of wilderness as wild, as the first part of that word suggests, but at the same time, pure, as Gilgamesh's partner, if you read the epic, it's not very long, Enkidu, is created for to be his helpmate. Gilgamesh is the king who has to he's searching for meaning in life, basically, and immortality. He finds that he can't do it. He was a bad king. So the gods create Enkidu, who's a natural man. And so he's very wild. He's hairy and so forth. So you already see from early on certain ideas, the kernels of this idea of city, civilization versus wild, wilderness. In North America, then, that becomes, as I've said, this idea of seeing wilderness as kind of sublime and there to be enjoyed by certain settler peoples. The other term, these are by chapters in Girard because I think they're useful, is apocalypse. We've talked about that. So we'll come back to that, which includes toxic discourse. We don't have to talk about all the science fiction films and things like that. Post-apocalyptic, whatever you want to call it, fascinating stories. It's interesting to me that some of the feminist writers today, like Margaret Atwood and so on, are doing the more effective post-apocalyptic writing, because that's going to change how society works, right? Animals. Peter Berger in 1980 talked about why look at animals in a famous essay, and how we objectify animals, and I know a lot of writers have said how we remove them from, on the one hand, if you look at the pet industry, for example, how pets are sort of infantilized and looked at very fondly. But on the other hand, we may be kind of careless about how other animals are treated. So he talked about that. But there's this idea of anthropomorphism and zoomorphism, where you represent animals with humans or animals with animal characteristics in art and media. Indigeneity, we've talked about. And then finally, the earth as Gaia. I think, have you encountered that? So the idea of Gaia, coming from the ancient Greek goddess idea, that James Lovelock a scientist actually in the 1970s, a British scientist, suggested that we talk about as if the planet is one organism. Even if it's not, even if, whatever you think, it's useful to think of it as a thought experiment, because then you say everything's interconnected, right? And so Gaia, G-A-I-A. Okay. So now to come to The Hungry Tide, as I mentioned, I would do a short reading. And again, I'll have to shorten this to some degree. And I'm mindful of looking at a number of writers that we may not get to in lecture 2. Besides The Hungry Tide, there's Aranyak, which is Vibhuti Bhushan's famous Bengali novel. Days and Nights in the Forest, right? Aranyak Din Ratri, right? Ken Saro-Wiwa, famous Nigerian writer. And then one writer that was new to me is Jangwanga Dema. I wanted to get someone new, young. She's from Botswana but lives in England, so we can talk about that. Again, we may not get to all of these, so keep in mind. So here's my reading of Hungry Tide. So it's set in the Sundarbans, of course, and is among the most studied texts in modern eco-criticism, both because it's clearly an eco-critique and because it is part of the wide, far-ranging oeuvre of a major writer who insistently decenters dominant worldviews and who compels readers to see that these worldviews cannot be understood without recognizing their interconnection with the natural environment. And I should add, he loves history, right, and the historicizing of this. Ghosh himself identifies this theme in The Great Derangement, as I mentioned, which is subtitled Climate Change and the Unthinkable. It was while visiting the Sundarbans as he worked on The Hungry Tide, he writes, that he, quote, became aware of the urgent proximity of non-human presences, unquote. This was partly because, he says, the landscape of the Sundarbans is, quote, so dynamic, remember the changing landscape, that its very changeability leads to innumerable moments of recognition, such as the fact that it is demonstrably alive, and that's his phrase, and not an inert, quote, stage for the enactment of human history. So most places have been, like even the Romantic poets, the setting is really a stage for human self-perception and reflection and so forth. How do we write about nature where nature itself is important, just as important, right? It's not there for being used by humans. Now, that understandably, we are the humans writing this, so it's going to be mediated through our view. We can't avoid that. But he wants to try it, as some other writers do, as Richard Powers tries to do. He also noticed the portents, the signs, the omens. He uses the word portents, that the forests were enduring irreversible change due to global warming. The Sundarbans is itself a protagonist in the story of the word protagonist he uses, the story of environmental changes and human relationships to them. But Ghosh observes that he would not have perceived these truths unless, quote, some prior awareness of what I was witnessing had not already been implanted in me in childhood. So he credits some kind of notion of this idea of nature being having its own existence, and changeable and agency, to something in his childhood. And he suggests that perhaps family lore of the ancestors had been forced to, had been at work here. And he says that the story enabled him to recognize that his ancestors, this is quote, were ecological refugees long before the term was invented. That's fascinating, right? So we discount the number of, now we're living in the greatest migrations in human history. We forget that, right? Wars are part of that. Wars then destroy nature landscapes, as in Palestine or wherever. So, um, but we also have so much history of that, even in from Bangladesh, the war and refugees, and climate migration is going to be even bigger now. It's already happening. So in the U.S., after Hurricane Katrina, 2010, I think it was, or 11 in New Orleans, the city is only half the population it used to be. It's still a nice city. I was there a few years ago, but it's only half. So that's happening. Where are the other people going? Right? So watch out for that. Also, risk theory. Insurance companies are no longer insuring in America for forest fires, for fire, or flood in many places. They say, well, we can't afford it. That's an index of what's happening, right? So as Ghosh writes in The Hungry Tide, in the voice of a character named Nilima, boats are finding it increasingly hard to traverse the Sundarbans waterways because, quote unquote, there isn't much water in the river nowadays. So in his depiction of the Sundarbans, mangrove forests, Ghosh adds a crucial element missing in other writers' descriptions of the regions, including Rushdie, who has what is a small section in The Midnight's Children. Many writers have used, set not maybe tiny scenes on the Sundarbans or have talked about forests in general. But what Ghosh does is the reality of drastic anthropogenic changes, right? He gives us a sense of how the Sundarbans region has been administered by both colonial and nation-state authorities, both of whom view the area's inhabitants as intruders into a generically wild environment, rather than, as he shows, people who live within what Eduardo Kohn, the anthropologist, calls an ecology of selves. So there's not this integral single self. It's hard to comprehend, I know. But we only have identity in terms of a community. That's how a lot of indigenous people see themselves. Ghosh does not romanticize these inhabitants, whose forebears, in fact, mostly arrived in the 19th century. He instead illustrates through characters whose childhood depends upon this watery world how comparatively detached most people, including his readers, excuse me, have become from the natural world. It is they, we, who preserve the wild civilized duality. The Sundarbans inhabitants, as Anu Jale concludes in her close study of the region, and she also is a friend of Ghosh, and he learned from her work. She concludes in her study that they have a deep understanding of the relatedness to an environment that is harsh for humans, but that the dominant groups are not listening to. So now, here's where I come to some important points, I believe. As we know, the indigenous people in the Sundarbans, if we're looking still at this case study, rely on fishing and gathering honey, wild honey. So fishing, those are the main ones. There are others. Honey and beeswax, right? Both of which expose them to attacks by the region's Royal Bengal tiger. To help readers gain some understanding of this mutually respectful human-environment relationship, he flourishes a number of narrative devices, including folk songs, staged dramas, animal calls, one character's diary, and the motif of translation, right? So he uses quite a number of different tactics, so the folk traditions of the Bon Bibi myth and so forth. And we want to keep this idea on seeing things anew. The motif of sight becomes powerful, right? I've argued that, and I don't know how convincing this is, but so there's a character named, a lot of you have read this or many, not everyone. There's a character named Kannai, who's the Kolkata. He's the translator, right? He's very urbane. He's scornful of. He's not particularly. He's very urban. He's somewhat scornful of these local traditions. He's even skeptical. He's a bit misogynistic, a little bit, with Pia, the cetologist who's studying dolphins. And there's a guy named Fokir who's the local. He does the fishing boat, and he has his boat, right? And he's been hired to take them to this island, to an excursion to look for the Irrawaddy dolphin. But Fokir gets so annoyed at Kannai that he pretends to abandon him on one of the islands in the mud banks. Well, the way I look at it is if you read that, the whole section is called a pilgrimage. This reflects my current project, but it relates to this in the sense that the motif of sight I was talking about, you start to see that motif everywhere because Kannai, he gets so frightened about the tiger, possibly, because they see the paw mark, and Fokir knows what he's doing, right? But Kannai, he's just terrified, and he kind of half loses consciousness. He almost faints. And he has kind of epiphany. So he sees, somehow he sees something new, an experience of nature. He's on the mud bank, and then he wipes the mud from his eyes. It's very symbolic. And when he does that, he sees, he's still angry at Fokir, but he's a little humbled. Does that make sense? So I argue that this is one way in which a writer, an imaginative writer, talks about, and it's not, no magic realism involved or anything. It's just saying how Kannai, who's very skeptical, has to learn the hard way to appreciate nature and Fokir's knowledge of it in a way that makes him more sensitive to this changeable environment, because the mud bank also changes constantly. And so it questions this whole idea of empirical knowledge and purely empirical. So Pia too has to learn this. She's the protagonist who's the dolphin expert. She's using GPS, but Fokir kind of knows more how to find the dolphin than the GPS. So we get these kinds of things going on. And I think that the way in which translation works from an eco-critical lens is that ultimately what these writers are doing is trying to translate that, a sense of that natural world and human connection to it, to the reader, right? So it's not just translating language, but maybe we might say the language of nature more broadly. Does that make sense? So I think there are different ways to read this. We also know that, as I said, he does not romanticize this, because we do have the villagers killing a tiger, right? A leopard, but it's ambiguous whether it's a leopard or a tiger, and because it's threatening their lives, right? So, and we also have the famous Moric Japi sad massacre episode, which again talks about that dilemma of we want to save animals because we've encroached on their world so much. This is all over the world. So now what do? We want to have a preserve for them, but then if we want a certain preserve, we may have to move people. Is that ethical, right? To save the animal? I don't know. Okay. Excuse me. The another thing that I think that The Hungry Tide does, and other writers' books do, is talks about the correspondence between language and landscape. I talked about wilderness and how we often create in our imaginations, right? For all practical purposes, it becomes real to us. We create a landscape by describing it, right? And that's how other people read about it. And then, because if you want to go visit a famous forest reserve, You read about it, right? You may get photos, but it's still translated for you. So this correspondence of how humans construct nature, but we don't want to talk about I don't at least subscribe to this idea of pure constructiveness. That is, it's not that language creates everything that's real. There is real nature there. The question is, to what degree do we unlearn the biases, the myths that the modern world inculcates in us? To what degree do we unlearn that so we can understand the workings of nature, right? That we have lost. And I think, again, listening to indigenous peoples is a key part of that. I'm going to skip ahead here to then, so if we turn to the, you can see some correspondences between the Hungry Tide that are interesting and Aranyak, which is the 1930s novel, which I read in translation, of course, by Vibhuti Bhushan. We have the same, and we also see it a bit in the Gangopadhyay's novel about Days and Nights in the Forest, where this kind of idealization of nature how the relationship between the characters, the main characters, and their preconceived notions of nature shapes them as compared to their every actual experience. For example, you might say that in Aranyak, as I note in other places, I've written about this in my book, the narrator compares a young tribal man to a sal tree, right? So that's a very, but that's done without a sense of irony. In other words, the narrator presumably thinks this is a favorable comparison. But to compare an indigenous person to a tree, as much as you might respect the tree, is problematic, right? Because again, you're naturalizing the native peoples and disallowing agency because it assumes that they are just exactly the same as a tree. So I think you can see some of that Ghosh is responding to that and trying to make us unlearn those ways of preconceiving the environment. I think that's very hard because, especially for environments we don't know well, how do we know them? We have to read about them. We have to look at images of them. One of the things that, and then I'll just close by looking at, so I'm going to close this section on sort of the, if I may, the Indian section of these examples by talking about how Aranyak, the other thing that comes up is that like The Home in the World by Tagore, this involves either as an undercurrent, maybe not explicitly, or sometimes explicitly stated the zamindar system. And so how this idea of land ownership and stewardship relates to class and things like that. This is what we might call environmental justice, as well as the land. Is environmental justice, does it depend on the land ethic? If so, then ultimately that means that land cannot be monetized. Land cannot be given $1 or rupee value. It's hard to see in a world today where that is going to be undone. But at least it's worth thinking about, because that was what the Native Americans, for example, were taken advantage of because they did not understand that concept. Like how can you own the land, right? That has become naturalized in our world, as if, well, of course you can own land. But no, that's not a natural point. So this idea of the zamindar system is under this, behind this, and he also, there's the subtitle that's given is Of the Forest, which essentially translates the Bangla word Aranyak. But this decision for translation suggests a couple of things in the English translation I read. And that is that some words, it suggests that why would they preserve the Sanskrit word for Aranyak? This seems like a small point, right, in the English translation. But again, it's a way to sort of perhaps essentialize the original manuscript, right? We could say. But it also points to the, again, whether you agree or not with that, is it points to this idea of how language affects how we see the land, because of course, this also refers to the books of the forest, right? Book of the forest in the Mahabharata and other things that these writers come to these texts with. Does that make sense? So they're just as all these words invoke a history of other associations that we then have to unpack. Does that make sense? So that if you're talking about, for example, if I use the word wilderness, I can no longer use that innocently, right? It comes today with a history. Does that make sense? So then the same way, I think Aranyak is, you have to read it in the context of a South Asian perspective, perhaps, or an Indian perspective. I'll just say this one phrase. I don't know, I checked it to read if there was time, but in describing the cruelties of the colonial state's mantra of progress, which depends to a large degree on deforestation. Now, this was written in the 1930s, so it's the British colonial state. The narrator is haunted by his certainty that these forests he loves will not stand for long. So again, we have this idea of a threat invoked to the forest in Bengal, and this idea that the novel is, for this reason, perhaps a confessional. It's about a man who goes and serves as, this forest officer, and he sees anew how we have to preserve this forest. And it concludes with the narrator lamenting his role in destroying forests, the memories of which still haunt him. So there's a sense of guilt in participating in that. I'm going to skip forward here now to, which is a long section in the notes, and talk about briefly Gangopadhyay's Days and Nights in the Forest. Another way to look at these is to look at them in literary history. And I'm not giving the plot summaries here. Those will be in the notes if you're interested. And you can look those up online. And we'll look at Ray's tiny clip from Ray's version, film version of this. But if you look at this as a part of India's, chronologically, you have Ananda Math, which I know I haven't talked about, but in 1882, and The Home in the World, 1906 or thereabouts, or something like that. And then you have Aranyak, and then you have Days and Nights in the Forest, right? Late 1960s. You see, it's interesting to see the trajectory, to see how thinking has changed about forests based on the colonial state, the British colonial context versus India's independence, right? The nation state. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. So there's these, let me read this one, give you some context here. This is another way to put eco-critical writings in perspective, is to give them a historical context. It's not necessary all the time, but that's what I've done. So, the first generation of writers upon independence generally had inevitably imbibed colonial era ideas, but by the 1960s and 70s, there was sufficient distance from both colonial rule and early nationalist promises to gain some perspective on this past. In this period, and I'm relying on some scholars here, small towns across the country gained economic prowess with the growth of agricultural output, and in turn gained political clout, challenging the influence of urban India's young and aspiring educated classes. Political agitation in towns and cities on numerous fronts, from anti-Hindi Tamil movements and anti-immigrant Marathi regionalists to communist movements in West Bengal and Kerala, further induced a feeling of insecurity among young urbanites. So this is the context for the novel, who clung to idealizations of village India, despite evidence to the contrary. So it's in this context that Gangopadhyay's 1968 novel, Aranyar Din Ratri, we should look at, one way to look at it. It's also a critique of the upper classes, the Bhadralok, sort of this idea of who are kind of these young men. If you don't know, there's these four men who stop, kind of arbitrarily decide to stop in one place. They want to go and experience nature and get away from the urban scene. And most of them are dissatisfied with their lives. This is 1968. It's a long time, quite a while ago. But they're very modern, urbane. And so they also have these pre-expectations, right? I think when we read these writers, we have to ask how they are countering our pre-expectations. What are they making us unlearn about the tribal, the Santals in this case, right? And they stop in a forest in which is now, I think, Jharkhand state, but was in West Bengal at the time, infused with idealizations of tribal men and especially women whom they identify with the wilds of the jungle. Each of the four friends is forced to confront his own, perhaps racial, cultural, and sexual prejudices. Gangopadhyay's forest or jungle, since he uses both the terms, is associated with the full range of images and tropes that are familiar, such as, and these are quotes from the English translation, "It is a veritable garden, an enchanting chiaroscuro of daylight fading slowly and darkness descending." That also invokes the title. "And where everything has become easy, including the availability of sex. One doesn't have to feel modesty in the jungle," Robi exults. "The forest is also a wilderness." We've encountered that word. Now, these are English translations, so it depends on how you translate it, "in which there is nothing to see or do." That's a common trope that urban writers of forests tend to invoke all over the world. What are these people doing? They're just lazy, right? And there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do. There's nothing to see. Surprising, we may think, because we've thought about these questions, but these are ordinary young professionals. Where the local Adivasis and Santals have behaved rather peculiarly, even mysteriously, and lived according to a different set of rules. So again, these are the tropes that I find. I mean, I'm not saying you will find those will catch your eye. But what surprises the young men is that money has found a purchase in this forest world. Right? That's not what they were expecting. It is not the untouched retreat they had imagined it to be. To the contrary, this is a world that still perpetuates colonial practices. Gangopadhyay portrays a forest that is nothing like the idyll of ashramic detachment from materiality. It is decidedly not a kind of tapovana or forest school that Tagore emulated. It instead stages the rape of a Santal woman, Duli, at the hands of one of the four men, Robi, its tough subjects. The men's superficial dalliances with the two genteel Calcutta women, and the city dwellers' condescending attitudes towards the Santals and the workers of the government bungalow. By the end of the novel, Robi has been beaten up by a group of Santal men for accosting Duli, the woman, and the four men have had their friendships tested, and each one has had to confront the prejudices hiding behind his bourgeois self. This is, after all, a Bengali novel, so it's going to have some Marxist overtones. So this idea of bourgeoisie, especially when interacting with the Santals. Now, if I could step out of the text, what we call the paratext, And we think, I'm not a film expert, but what I've read about Ray's filming, Ray, Satyajit Ray, but Ray, is that he was clearly loved Kolkata. That was his passion, right? And it is a great city of intellectual intellect and books and all this, and arts. But it's interesting that this is a story about that's very critical of the urban youth at the time. They're disaffected. They don't know what to do. Now, is that their fault or not? That's a different story. So there's that. There's also, for me, an unsettling fact that the actress who portrays Duli, the famous Garwal, what's her name? Someone know? It's slipped my brain. I told you I'm getting old, but and I'm even older than when we started this lecture. But the idea that she has to put makeup on to make her Adivasi. That's very disturbing to me, right? And what we call in America blackface. So if you try to portray, because it has a history. Now, I'm not saying it has a history in India, but couldn't you get another actress? So these are the paratexts that raise other issues. Now, that is not specific to the eco-critical point, but it does raise the question of, the fact that Gangopadhyay I think it's a great novel, and Gangopadhyay is critical of these four men, and so is Ray's movie. But after all, the medium through which we see it, the tribals don't have a say, really. These are not, and on the other hand, this is the paradox we run into. If you do give them a voice, this is post-colonial part coming in, then you're sort of being the arbiter and giving them agency. You're ventriloquizing their existence. That's inauthentic. It's what, of course, what Spivak talked about with the subaltern idea. So how do you access that? But that's the same problem as accessing non-human worlds. How do you do that? You can't entirely. You just have to do your best. There is no pure way of doing this. And I think that's one important lesson here, that there are some writers who do that better than others, and we're learning. So another trope that we want to keep in mind, and then I'll end with touching on Sarawiwa, is that Raymond Williams wrote a book, The Country and the City, in the early 1970s. And that idea still pertains. I mentioned Gilgamesh and the city and all that. So if we back up, I've zoomed in on a couple of novels. If we back up and talk about how, if that's true that we have always looked at this city and country, how is modern writing different, right? And that, in that sense, I think modern writing is trying to bring a more ethical focus, for one thing. Secondly, it's trying to, as I said, decenter the human. Even if you go back to any epic, whether it's Gilgamesh or anything, the humans are always the center, And that's understandable, right? That it wasn't, you may say, oh, in their mythic stories, the Greeks, they talked about animals, but it's always with humans at the center. So that the one thing that post-colonial writers do is, like Ghosh, is to try their best to make us see not just different things, the non-human world, but also to see the marginalized views, right? The oppressed. And that's hard to do, but I think that's an important takeaway. So the country and the city becomes, as Raymond Williams did, it can still kind of preserve an idealized version of untouched local culture that he had, even though he was a Marxist, and so he still idealized that. And I think that a lot of countries, I think most countries, the narratives about the nation are built on this construct of the ideal sort of certain lands, villages, or you know, mera gaon, mera desh, you know, and this idea, and and then the same thing in America, right? The heartland, they say, is the rural areas. That's not true anymore, right? If it ever was. And so I think that construct is something we have to dig into and deconstruct. So Ken Saro-Wiwa, and I think we just have a couple of minutes here, I'm shifting now to the Nigerian writer, and introduces the term petrocultures. So Rob Nixon uses that term to talk about in slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor, slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor. And I like that term. He's not the only one to notice that. For example, Rachel Carson talks about pollution as a slow movement. That's where he really gets inspired to this term. You don't see it. When humans don't see something, we're kind of too stupid to, appreciate that. That's why climate change is. Now, if you're in it, if you bear the brunt, yes, but not everyone does. But we still suffer from it, like pollution and so forth. So he's from a small group called the Ogoni people of Nigeria. And I've learned something more about Nigeria from my Nigerian doctoral students. And so there are many different languages, Igbo, Hausa, and so forth, Yoruba. And they produce some fantastic literature these days. He was a writer who was popular for television writing as well as novels. He even produced a novel in Pidgin English, right? Soza Boy, which is fascinating. And you have to have a glossary to read it, right? So he's a brilliant writer. In 1995, he had always protested the giving over of this small minority their land to Shell Oil Company. Now, we all here know about the East India Company having an army of 100,000 people. I mean, what kind of corporation has an army? Well, Shell also effectively did. They had hired these security forces, thousands of them, because the government was getting kickbacks, right? The dictatorship of Abacha. And Rob Nixon also talks about this, as does William Boyd, a British novelist who knew Saro-Wiwa. And oil was always at the center in fact, it was at the center of the civil war for Nigeria, the Biafra War in late 1960s that both Chinua Achebe and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talk about. So, and I hadn't known that was at the center, right, until recently. So Saro-Wiwa said he had been campaigning so much that they put him in prison, first of all. So he wrote this great thing. I wish I had time to read it. An open list of demands that he drafted and was published from prison. He says, "We, the people of Ogoni," and then he names several subgroups, numbering about 500,000, being a separate and distinct ethnic nationality within the Federal Republic of Nigeria, wish to draw the attention of the government and people of Nigeria to the undermentioned facts. And he gives a whole bunch. And in the notes here, I just have 10 of them. And I'm just going to read 2. That the Ogoni people, before the advent of British colonialism, were not conquered or colonized by any other ethnic group in present-day Nigeria. And then he goes on and talks about that oil was struck and produced in commercial quantities on our land in 1958. Did they see the profits? No. He was hanged by the Abacha government, right? Despite an international outcry, despite many writers, leaders. And that's what happens. That's petroculture when you're so corrupted by, this is from the land, right? This is the land that gives you the petroleum. And we know these stories throughout the world, right? From Venezuela on, where that then, that's where the question of who owns the land comes in. It raises all kinds of existential questions. It raises questions about how do we exploit, why are we exploiting the land in this way? And Shell Oil has never to this day apologized, right? So I'm not being paid to criticize Shell Oil, but um, it's a big company. It's a British Dutch company. But the point is that um, this is the reality. So Saruiwa does this very eloquently in that journal that I assigned parts of, uh, a month and a day. Um, and I think that this can really be a powerful way of learning when someone puts their life on the line for the land. It's also for his people, to be sure, but it's also for the land. So I think that's something we can keep in mind. I don't think there's time to go. I think it's time. Yeah, sorry. If you're interested, the Jangwa Dema's writing, the Botswanian British writer who emigrated to UK, has some wonderful prize-winning poems about. It's called Anne/Other Pastoral. So she's talking about land in different ways. Thank you.